Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, November 24th, 2021, and less than a year out until the 2022 Senate race in the state of Pennsylvania, the Republican Trump-endorsed frontrunner Sean Parnell officially suspending his bid for United States Senate for the upcoming 2022 midterm elections. Now, Sean Parnell has been the frontrunner for quite some time now. There really hasn't been much GOP opposition to him being that declarative GOP nominee. With Donald Trump's endorsement, nobody really could have opposed him. Sean Parnell made a name for himself back during the 2020 election season after he spoke at the Republican National Convention, being no more than a Pennsylvania House congressional candidate here. When it came down to the eventual results, he came very close to actually defeating Conor Lamb, another candidate for the 2022 Senate race in the general election. Now, Conor Lamb had previously won this district by a margin of double digits, so for Conor Lamb to be narrowed down to a point where he was just within 2 points of being defeated by this Republican, he immediately became that frontrunner, someone who could win in a district indicative of the rest of the state and pretty much a very good area to come from when it comes down to statewide runs. That's why Conor Lamb and Sean Parnell were both in this race, because they come from a region of the state where they could truly do very well in a primary, and both of which seem to be top contenders for that general election spot. But something happened in Sean Parnell's life that ultimately prioritized other things that mattered to him over this Senate race. More specifically, this issue with his children and custody, something that a judge recently ruled upon, stripping him away of full custody, giving it to his wife after he was accused of abuse of both his spouse and his child. So these are things that make Sean Parnell, number one, a candidate who has a lot of baggage to his name. But number two, because he disagrees with this decision from the judge, he says, "This is my main priority. I do not want my children thinking that I prioritized a Senate race over them. I don't want my children thinking that I focused more on politics than I did about family affairs." And it makes sense. He is clearly more concerned about the well-being of his children, or partially more concerned about, other things dealing with this entire court case and the well-being of his family, much more, at least from what we've gathered here, than the Pennsylvania Senate race. So all around here, I think that what this does is it puts the Democratic Party in a better position. This means that the GOP frontrunner has gone, and he's completely removed himself from this race together. So the Democrats are looking at Pennsylvania with a bit more of an optimistic tone, primarily because the state itself is typically close. We'll go into some red year elections, normal elections, and 2022 as well. But what this does is gives the Democratic Party more time to attack some of these declared candidates for the nomination spot. With Sean Parnell being out, the GOP is scrambling. Who does Trump endorse? Who do these top Republicans endorse? Is this time for a re-entrance of Pat Toomey? Is this time for an entrance of a current incumbent GOP congressman? Who knows what's next? No one here running seems to be a strong contender or someone who has served in an executive position across the state. There is no statewide elected officials. There is no one who is a complete recognizable name across the state of Pennsylvania, and none of these already declared candidates have been able to win over President Trump's endorsement following Sean Parnell's withdrawal from the race. So here's what's happening. Looking at the Democratic side of the Pennsylvania race here, you see that Conor Lamb and John Fetterman are in the top two contender positions. Looking at the endorsements, they've received roughly equal endorsements. I would say that Conor Lamb and John Fetterman have definitely different voting groups here. You're looking at a more progressive background for John Fetterman and a more centrist, maybe even conservative background for Conor Lamb. Looking at the polling data here, John Fetterman definitely has taken the lead here, and actually, when it comes down to polling, seems to be doing just as well in the general election. Now, here's something that I do want to point out as well. With Sean Parnell's removal from the race, the state itself becomes more Democratic leaning, and you can see this. There are two polls here. You have Garin, Hart, Yang. They did a joint poll here, and Data for Progress, both of which are quote-unquote Democratic internals and do favor the Democrats. Sure, which makes sense. You're not going to see much data, especially since we don't know who the nominees are now, and there's so much more uncertainty today than there was just 2 days ago when it came down to the Senate race. John Fetterman defeats a Republican opponent here by large margins in both of these polls. Conor Lamb doesn't do as well. But when facing off against Sean Parnell, both of these Democrats perform worse. Sean Parnell has made a name for himself. The reason why these potential names here, Jeff Bartos is at 36%, 38%, is not because the majority of the state is against him or them, rather that the amount of the undecided vote skyrockets when people don't know who the names are. People know Sean Parnell. People know Connor Lamb. They know John Fetterman. Maybe not as well as Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, but they certainly know some of these more known figures across the state. Connor Lamb as a representative, Sean Parnell, Trump endorsed, John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor. These are recognizable names. So as we take a look at the polling data here, it's clear that Sean Parnell, at least for right now, was that strongest nominee. And that, again, puts the Democratic Party in a much better position than they were previously in. So, all around this Senate race, I told you guys we would take a look at 2010 and 2016. Everything that we have discussed so far has told us this race was going to be close. And a dropping from the frontrunner, the Trump-endorsed candidate, simply does not add to that case. Sean Parnell is in this position where, as the GOP frontrunner, needs to endorse someone, and it doesn't look like the GOP has that many top-tier candidates. From those who have publicly expressed interest, the Republicans might have to pressure some of these people to enter back into the race or enter into the race for the first time. Looking at the list here as well, I also don't see that many top names. The only one that really struck out to me as a very big shocker and also might be a possibility now that Sean Parnell is out of the race is Dr. Oz. That's something that I think maybe shocks some of you, maybe not necessarily. Celebrity personalities is a new thing, but I would say that him being a potential contender is also just quite comical if you're asking me. Not to say that he couldn't be elected or he wouldn't make a name for himself, but whenever I see celebrities dabbling into politics, it's typically something that isn't regarded as very serious. But as Donald Trump and many other people before, Ronald Reagan, Arnold Schwarzenegger, have shown, it is possible, certainly, to be a celebrity and involved in politics. But it is just quite interesting to see that now that we no longer have a GOP frontrunner in Pennsylvania, people are turning to quite literally anyone to pick up this race. So now I want to pivot into why I think that this result or this withdrawal from the race ultimately jeopardizes the Republican Party's chances of victory in here because of the true competitive nature of Pennsylvania. And we can see this in the 2020 election, in which Joe Biden heavily focused on Pennsylvania. I remember there was criticism back in the 2020 election where people were asking, why is Joe Biden not shifting money away from the Rust Belt into different regions of the state, regions of the country, when polling data was saying that all of a sudden Texas was now competitive and Florida was within reach and North Carolina was about to tip over the Democratic side. People were wondering, why isn't Joe moving the money here? And it was because I think the Biden campaign realized how competitive this region actually was going to be. And Pennsylvania ended up being one of the most competitive states of the election cycle. It was decided by a margin of 1.2%. And while a lot of the counties ultimately shifted towards the left, some shifted towards the right, but most of them shifted towards the left, the margin was still pretty close. Donald Trump received 49% of the vote, and Joe Biden received 50% of the vote. And this bellwether county for Pennsylvania, Erie County, ended up going to Joe Biden by a margin of 1.1%. So had Biden not focused as much money on Pennsylvania or as much energy and effort, he might not have been able to win the state. And while the national environment was Biden plus 4.5%, practically Biden plus 5%, Democrats end with the trifecta. They won Pennsylvania by a percentage point. And this isn't particular to presidential elections. I mean, we know that it was also close back in 2016. Hold on a second, I have no idea what just happened there. In 2016, Pennsylvania was decided by 0.72%. But in the Senate election specifically, we've seen it also just as competitive. Even in 2016, when Pat Toomey was riding the wave of Donald Trump resurging Republican support across the state, Pat Toomey only defeated Katie McGinty, who arguably had some questionable campaign mistakes here, that won the state by 1.5% over Katie McGinty. He was able to defeat the Democratic opponent here by only less than 2%. 2010 was a year that was much better for the GOP, the margin roughly the same. Across the state of Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey, in a red wave year in which the House of Representatives went to the GOP with them flipping 63 seats across the map. And what happened here was that Pat Toomey defeated Joe Sestak by a margin of just 2%. On the same ballot that the Republican governor was winning by a margin of nearly 10 points, actually, 9 points across the state, Pat Toomey was only able to win by a margin of 2%. Fast forward to 6 years later, even as an incumbent, wins by a narrower margin. So Pennsylvania, like I said, is accustomed to being a swing state, even depending on a beneficial national environment for Democrats or a beneficial national environment for Republicans. And you can actually see this. There's a reason why in my most recent Senate election projection that I kept Pennsylvania in the lean Republican column. This made sense to me. Because the state itself had moved in unison with Wisconsin since July, a lot of you guys had asked, why didn't Pennsylvania move over into the likely column? I've moved them together, so what's different about this circumstance? Well, Wisconsin has shown us that it's a lot more receptive to the national environment than Pennsylvania is as well. And that's something that I wanted to point out. Pennsylvania will probably be at most lean for either political party, and in many chances could end up being tilt between Republicans and Democrats. The point being that Pennsylvania is always a close race, which means that both parties are going to be fighting for every single vote. And when you have one clear frontrunner in which the Republican Party of Pennsylvania seem to have been really corralling behind, and all of a sudden they have to withdraw, an unexpected withdrawal at not. This was not something that the GOP was preparing for at all, expecting from Sean Parnell. I mean, he had been dealing with this issue for quite some time now, but ultimately decided that this was enough. You know, this puts the GOP in a very unfortunate position because now they need to pick someone. They need to choose from this publicly expressed interest column, the potential column, and the thing is, not many of these people that were top contenders have even thrown any interest into this race itself. If you are on the potential list, it means you have not spoken on the race itself. You have yet to acknowledge the existence of the race in many ways, and that's why this is also so alarming. When you have an open seat, usually so many people vie for it, and now that Donald Trump's endorsement is out, you might actually see that. But before, even Sean Parnell probably wasn't even the strongest nominee for the GOP. He just seemed to be the one that was most adored and most respected by President Trump, and consequently received his endorsement. But that endorsement can both be, something that pushes you through the primary, but makes you plummet in the general election. There are different scenarios for this. Of course, different types of circumstances electorally could really impact the overall results of the eventual Senate election. But I do think that now that we are in a position where we need to look for GOP nominees, it definitely is a bit alarming that many of these people have yet to speak on it, even before Sean Parnell's withdrawal. And even in this publicly expressed interest column, this potential column, there really aren't the best nominees for the GOP. I mean, Dr. Oz could be a possibility, but again, he wouldn't be a top nominee. I would say that the top nominees that we could see, the first one would certainly be Pat Toomey, the incumbent United States Senator, but he is deciding to withdraw himself from the race. In most scenarios, he probably would have been primaried, but there is a possibility that had he made it to the general election, he would have been able to win it again. These representatives, some of them who decided to endorse Sean Parnell, remove themselves from the race, might enter back in. But the thing is, these are representatives. They are in a cushiony position. It might depend primarily on the redistricting process in Pennsylvania, whether or not their districts are drawn more competitive or less competitive. But when you're in a cushiony congressional seat, you might not be inclined to run for United States Senate. Sean Parnell had neither of the two. He was not an incumbent senator. He was not an incumbent representative. So he technically had nothing to lose by running for United States Senate. And that's where it also gets a bit tricky. Connor Lamb is effectively giving up his seat. And we don't know how it's going to be drawn, primarily because Pennsylvania is losing a congressional district, but he doesn't care. He's deciding to run. The Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman would have to vacate the Lieutenant Governor seat if elected to the United States Senate. I would argue that Connor Lamb has more to lose than John Fetterman, especially since John Fetterman doesn't have to run for re-election in 2022 if he doesn't want to, but Connor Lamb in all eventuality would probably be forced to by the Pennsylvania Democratic Party because of his strong Democratic support in the past. John Fetterman doesn't need to be there in order for the Lieutenant Governorship to be blue. It could totally be won by somebody else. I can't necessarily say for what might be Connor Lamb's future district. And not to say that John Fetterman isn't necessarily a strong candidate, but I point that out to say that a lieutenant governorship can be easily replaced, but sometimes we have 20-term incumbents in the House of Representatives in seats that otherwise would be winnable by the Democrat or Republican Party, and just having that one incumbent in there could really screw you out of a race for 10, 20 years. For that 20-term incumbent that we've seen, many of them have been serving for very long terms. That could very well be 40 years of you preventing an opposition party from winning your district, even if they they may be the favored ones across the state. So, looking at Sean Parnell's withdrawal from the race, main takeaway, this is not good news for the Republican Party. We've seen just how competitive it can get regardless of the election year, 2016, 2010, 2020. Altogether, with few exceptions, Pennsylvania is an extremely competitive race, and the GOP frontrunner completely withdrew himself from the race, not endorsing anyone at this point in time. This leaves two major endorsements up, Sean Parnell and Donald Trump. The one that I would say is the most important is Donald Trump's endorsement from here, but the GOP actually needs to find someone to replace Sean Parnell that can actually win the general election and is the best type of nominee, because to be quite honest with you, Sean Parnell may not have been the best nominee for the GOP, and now they have a second chance. But it also sets them back quite a bit. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.